With this lecture, I'm going to give an overview of the Pentateuch, or the Torah. The name Pentateuch comes from the Greek for 5 volumes. Torah is often translated law, but teaching or instruction would be more accurate. There's a lot more in there than law. The books included are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's a foundation narrative. Covers from the creation of the world to the death of Moses. It gives Israel's self-understanding of its place in the world. That's what we mean by a foundation narrative. It's the most sacred part of the Scripture for Jews, just as we Catholics stand when we read the Gospel. Jews stand when the Torah is read. Their lectionary is a 1-year cycle. They read the entire Torah every year, and each Sabbath, writings from the prophets are selected to go with the Torah. We choose the Gospel as our main reading and choose the first reading to go with the Gospel. The literary composition, traditionally it is ascribed to Moses, but certain questions arose. For instance, the death of Moses is narrated in the last chapter of Deuteronomy. And even in the ancient world, the question of how did Moses write about his own death? Back then, they said, well, God revealed it to him ahead of time. From the Orthodox perspective, every word of the Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, including the years of wandering after Sinai before they got to the Promised Land. All of that was written down. And from the Orthodox perspective, not only that, but also all of the Mishnah, which is post-biblical tradition, that was revealed to Moses, and it was only put into writing by Judah the Prince 200 years after Jesus, but all revelation in Orthodox Jewish theology comes from Sinai. Well, since the Enlightenment, when we started studying science scientifically and history scientifically, there have been questions about Mosaic authorship. The existence of doublets. There are 3 stories where a patriarch passes his wife off as a sister. Scholars now think that our current Pentateuch is the result of a long process of oral and written tradition. Our 5 volumes were put in their current form after the Babylonian exile, perhaps about 450 BC. That would be about 800 years after Moses. He's traditionally dated about 1250 BC. So Genesis is a prequel. I first heard of this word, it's the opposite of sequel, in connection with the Star Wars movie. The original Star Wars, even back then it said Episode 4. And so the 3 Star Wars were 4, 5, and 6. And then finally we got the prequel about how Darth Vader, who started off as Anakin Skywalker, a noble Jedi Knight, how he falls from grace and begins to serve the dark side of the Force. All of that is in the prequel. So Christopher Frechette, in his article in the Reader's Guide in the new edition of the Catholic Study Bible, calls Genesis a prequel. The first Star Wars, well, the first story that Israelites knew was the story of the Exodus. That was the original story that they heard. The prequel answers the questions, how did we get down to Egypt in the first place? How are we related to each other? Just like in Star Wars, eventually you learn that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. Who would have known it, okay? Who would have known that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were related? The prequel explains all that. How did the Egyptians and all the other countries get where they were? How did the world get here? So it answers these questions not on the basis of modern science, but on the basis of ancient storytelling. Creation. There are 2 stories. Genesis 1 is modeled on the Marduk epic, the Babylonian epic, but it's revised for a monotheistic perspective. The creation is not the result of a battle between the gods over which Marduk triumphs, but rather it's the work of the one true God who creates effortlessly with a word. Let there be light, and there was light. Genesis 2-3 is a more ancient story of the garden. It contains elements found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, before 1800, the Bible was the only ancient Semitic source that we had. In the 1800s and 1900s, whole libraries have been dug up. And so now we have other ancient literature that we can compare the Bible to, which just did not exist for the fathers of the church or for medieval theologians or even for the reformers or the counter-reformers. A picture's worth 1,000 words. The worldview of Genesis. So the features are a firmament with stars, and that's a solid dome. And above that solid dome is, it says there, the ocean of heaven, or the waters above the heavens. Did you ever wonder why the sky is blue? It's because of all the water on top of it. Now, we can tell you about spectrographs and red light and blue light and whatever, but the ancients explained it's all the water above it. The waters above the heavens, in Hebrew, those are called Hamabul, which is the flood. And so, when Psalm says, the Lord is enthroned above the flood, it's not thinking of flooding in Louisiana or whatever, and God has a chair on top of it. It's thinking of the sky, the flood above the sky, which makes it blue, and the Lord is enthroned up above at the very top, above the flood. And if you look closely, you can see floodgates, and some diagrams will show storerooms connected to the floodgates, out of which comes water, hail, snow, whatever God wants to put down. You don't see the floodgates open because clouds are in the way. Okay? And then there's the underworld, Sheol, the world of the dead. Now, the problem of fundamentalism, fundamentalists imagine that Genesis describes a round earth which is part of the solar system. So not only are they poor scientists with their creationism and stuff like that, but they don't really understand what the Bible is literally saying. This is what the Bible is literally saying. A flat earth with a solid sky with an ocean above it. So they claim to be literally interpreting the Bible, but they're not. We have the story of increasing human sinfulness. Adam and Eve sin, then Cain kills Abel. Lamech doesn't take sevenfold vengeance. He takes 70-fold vengeance for anyone who harms him. And so the Jewish tradition sees the sin of Adam and Eve as the first of many sins, but it's not in any way for them causative of later sins. They do not see Genesis as a fall from grace. As they read Genesis, humans have always been sinful from the beginning. God has punished sin from the beginning. That's the bad news. The good news is that from the beginning, God has been merciful. Later, post-biblical Christian theology would see original sin in Genesis 3. But that's a post-biblical development. As a believer, I'll say there's a lot of truth there in that doctrine. But it's not what Genesis teaches. The flood. At least two narratives have been combined. In one source, the flood lasts 40 days, and the other, it lasts a year. In one source, Noah takes two of each animal, a male and a female. And the other source, Noah takes 7 pairs of clean animals, but only 1 pair of the unclean. And that's the source that narrates that there's a sacrifice after Noah gets out of the ark. Can you imagine these poor animals making it all the way through the flood, and then he sacrifices them? If you only have 1 pair of each, you've got a problem because you've just wiped out the animals that you saved. Now, we also know that 1 pair or even 7 pairs, modern science tells us, if the gene pool has gotten that small, you're extinct. But again, this is the ancient view of the world, not the modern. The flood story is essentially the undoing of creation. Genesis, in the beginning, it tells how God separates the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens. He puts the firmament in place with the floodgates, and He makes order out of chaos. And in the flood, the whole thing comes crashing down again. So it's essentially the undoing of creation. There were many ancient flood stories among the ancient Semites. Probably the unique thing about the Bible is it gives it a moral spin. In some of the other stories, the gods are annoyed because the people are making too much noise, and so they decide to wipe them out. It's not the story of capricious gods, but it uses the flood story for the purpose of inculcating morality. Abraham. Now, when I was in the seminary in the early 70s, I was taught that with Abraham, we finished prehistory and we get to the beginning of what we could call history in our modern sense. And this was the result of archaeological work by the famous William F. Albright, a great scholar in the 50s and 60s. The historicity of the patriarchal narratives is currently being seriously questioned. Much of it is eponymous writing. What does eponymous writing mean? Here's a modern example. Mother America had two daughters, Virginia and Georgia. So basically, I'm telling the story of my country. And how is it that Virginia and Georgia are roughly equal? They have representatives and senators, well, they're sisters, and they were both born from Mother America. So there's a certain historicity there, but it's not history as you and I would understand it in our modern sense. And more on this in an advanced course. The call of Abraham in Genesis 12 marks a turning point in the story. The narrative turns from the story of the whole of humanity and focuses on the story now of one people. God makes a covenant with Abraham. He promises Abraham land and descendants. Isaac is a shadowy character, serves as a transitional figure between Abraham and Jacob. The memorable story of his youth is his almost sacrifice by his dad, Abraham. And a rabbi once pointed out to me, as the Bible narrates the story, it is never reported that Isaac ever spoke to Abraham after that point. And a memorable story, as a blind old man, he's tricked by his son Jacob into giving his blessing to Jacob, his younger son. Jacob struggles with Esau in the womb of Rebekah. Esau is the ancestor of the Edomites. He tricks his dumb older brother out of his birthright for a pot of porridge. He lies to cheat his older brother out of the blessing with the help of Mom. And he has to flee for his life, where he meets his uncle Laban. And there he meets his match. He loves Rachel, who's pretty, and serves Laban for 7 years. And then on the wedding night, Laban substitutes Leah, who had bleary eyes, and when Jacob wakes up in the morning, he's married to the wrong one. And Laban says, it's not our custom to give the younger daughter first. So he serves 7 more years and finally gets Rachel, whom he loves. So he who had cheated his own older brother, his uncle does a similar thing to him with his own older daughter that he's having trouble marrying off. What goes around comes around. Eventually he has 4 wives, Rachel, Leah, and their 2 servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, who give him 12 sons. And so the 12 sons of Jacob are the children of 4 wives. And I say sometimes, so much for bumper sticker theology. One man, one woman, God's plan. Okay. And he wrestles with God at the Jabbok, which is a brook or a river, And his name is changed to Israel, which sounds a little bit in Hebrew like wrestles with God. El is God, and Yisra sounds like a little bit like he wrestles. But it's really a bad pun. It's not a scientific etymology. Anyway, the Joseph story is an extended novella. He was especially dear to the northern tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh are portrayed as his sons, and they are the two largest tribes in the northern kingdom. The story explains how Israel came to go down to Egypt, where it was eventually enslaved. And Pope John the 23rd used the Joseph story. His name in Italian was Giuseppe, which is Italian for Joseph. He's the first pope to invite the Jews to come to the Vatican, and everyone was wondering, what's the Pope going to say? Is he going to tell them they have to believe in Jesus Christ? What's the Pope going to say? And the first words out of his mouth were, Io sono Giuseppe suo fratello. I'm Joseph, your little brother. The Exodus. So the preliminary events, we have the story of the birth of Moses and his salvation from the murderous plan of Pharaoh to kill all the baby boys. And my friend and colleague Amy Jill Levine says when as a young girl she went to Christian catechism. She's Jewish, but her daddy let her go. She started learning the story of Matthew, and there was a wicked king trying to kill Jesus when he was born. She said, just like Moses, which is exactly Matthew's point. She got it intuitively. Then we get the call of Moses at the burning bush and the revelation of God's name. The 10 plagues of Egypt were actually a combination of several sources. There's some overlap, but no single source has more than 8 plagues. 7, and then the great final plague of the death of the firstborn. The Passover lamb is eaten on the night of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. The Passover is celebrated to this day among Jews. It has an important part in New Testament theology. Then the Exodus, several sources are combined in Exodus 14 in one source. It seems to be that there's a strong east wind blowing the water away and the Israelites get through, but when the Egyptians try it, their chariot wheels get stuck in the mud and the water comes back and drowns them. In another version, it's like the Cecil B. DeMille version. He stretches out the rod and the waters part and they walk through with a wall on the right and a wall on the left. And then Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, in that version, the Lord picks the Egyptians up and throws them into the sea. And the poetry is extremely ancient, I think. There's a debate among scholars. Is this ancient Hebrew or archaic? Is it just writing in an old style, but it's really late? And Brother Aloysius Fitzgerald, who has forgotten more about Hebrew than I'll ever know, God rest him, he was convinced that it was ancient Hebrew. And he knew more about other ancient languages than I'll ever know. It's out of respect for him that I'm in the ancient camp there. The covenant. Israel came to view its relation with Yahweh, the Lord, as a type of covenant. The main covenants in the ancient world were political treaties. Basically, there were 2 kinds. Parity covenants between nations that were roughly equal, that would be like today between the U.S. and Russia, and suzerainty covenants between a great king and his vassals. That would be like the kind of relationship that used to exist between Russia and the satellite states in the Soviet Union, which Putin would like to reestablish. And this last model, that of a great king and his lowly vassals, that was the model for Israel's covenant. They thought of God as the great king, and they, Israel, were the lowly vassal. The gift of the law at Sinai, the most famous part of the law, is the Decalogue. And Christians should note, however, that the Jewish tradition does not consider these 10 commandments to be more sacred than the other 603. There are 603 in the Torah. Much of the content, the prohibitions against murder, adultery, and so on, can be found in previous law codes. The Stele of Hammurabi shows him receiving the Code of Hammurabi, which is 500 years before Moses, from his God. In the ancient world, it was common to think of law as a gift from the deity. We think of laws as things that we people make up. That's democracy. But back then, law was thought of as coming from God's. The important thing with Israel's law is the context. It's not that nobody else knew that murder was bad or adultery was bad and so on. This is part of the covenant which the Lord God makes with Israel. So this is part of what makes them God's people. That's the context that's important. Leviticus, this is where most Christians bog down when they try to read the Bible straight through. It's the center of the Pentateuch. The final editors put it there because for them this was the most important part, more important than Genesis or Exodus. During the exile and immediately after, the most urgent priority of the priest was to restore sacrifices in the temple. And that's why this, that most of us find so boring to read, was put in the honored center place of the Pentateuch. Everything else, from their perspective, is for the sake of this. Numbers takes us from Sinai to Moab. Israel leaves Sinai in chapter 10. In chapter 33, they're on the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River. Numbers 20, we get waters from the rock, which is a repetition of the same story in Exodus 17. And Reginald Fuller, the British scholar, points out that the rabbis, since the story is told twice and they didn't know about different sources, different versions of the same story, they assumed that the rock followed them from Sinai to where they were there. He describes it as a traveling canteen. And those of you who have had my course on Paul, note that in Corinthians, Paul says not only that, and the rock followed them through the desert, and the rock was Christ. And when I first read that, I said, what was he smoking when he thought that up? Anyway, and my other favorite story from Numbers is the story of Balaam. He's hired by the king to curse the Israelites. And on the way, he's riding the ass, and there's an angel that's standing in the way with his sword drawn. He's going to kill Balaam. The ass stops, and Balaam beats it, and it gets around the angel. Then the angel gets in a narrower place. The ass stops again, and Balaam is whacking it, and finally the poor beast goes over. But it's narrow, so he scrapes Balaam's leg on the side of the ridge as he's getting by this deadly angel. And now Balaam is really in a bad mood. And now the angel, storyteller's rule of three, is right there, and there's no place either on the right side or the left, and Balaam is just wailing the tar out of the ass. And the ass says, aren't I your faithful little ass who's taken you wherever you wanted to go? And Balaam, not the least bit surprised that the animal is talking, says that, yes, and I'm going to beat you to death if you don't get up and go. And then his eyes are opened and he sees the angel, and the angel says, now, you better thank that little ass because I would have killed you for sure, and now you better go and bless Israel, don't curse them. When I was a seminarian, the professor was trying to teach us not to take all of the stories literally. He said, now gentlemen, do we have here a historical miracle? And one of my classmates said, I don't think it was a miracle, Father. I think the angel was a ventriloquist. Deuteronomy is the final words of Moses. It's a well-known ancient literary form, the final words of a famous man. This is, they make a whole book out of it. It's Moses' sermon on the plains of Moab before Israel is going to cross over. Now, it was discovered at the time of Josiah. It says there that a scroll of the law was discovered, this would be like about 630 or something, in the temple in Jerusalem. Most scholars think that this scroll that was discovered was the core of Deuteronomy, probably chapters 12 to 26. And Rabbi Klein, my friend, thinks that this core was probably the earliest written form of the Law of Moses. Eventually, the Law of Moses will be all of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So when we read about the Law of Moses, it's important to know what state of Israelite history are we in. Are we talking about 15 chapters from Deuteronomy, or 20 chapters, or are we talking about the whole Torah that we consider today? So the question is, had this scroll been hidden in the temple earlier? Those who propose this say perhaps about 100 years before, during the time of Hezekiah. But many scholars think that it was composed for the occasion. They wrote up these traditions and presented it to the king, and it was done by reformers who were trying to promote the worship of Yahweh only. They were worshiping many gods, and so the Yahweh only partisans, who were a minority at this time, actually planted this scroll. They authenticate it, not by modern archaeological methods, but they authenticate it by taking it to the prophetess Huldah. And she looks at it and says, yeah, this is the real deal. This really did come from Moses. So then Josiah starts his reform, tearing down pagan altars and everything like that, which is what he wanted to do anyway. And so that's why scholars wonder, was the scroll composed for the occasion? Deuteronomistic theology, and if you read about the Old Testament, say, well, that's Deuteronomistic theology. What that means is God rewards fidelity to the covenant. God punishes infidelity to the covenant. Ironically, this belief in the Lord's fearful punishment is a source of hope. If you read in Deuteronomy 28, the people are going to be besieged and they're going to be so hungry they're going to eat their own babies. And I mean, it's really, really bad. This is what's going to happen if you don't follow my covenant. We won't read Deuteronomy 28 out loud at this point, but it's gross. And the point is that when that's put into writing, it has already happened. And if we are slaves in Babylon because Marduk, the god of Babylon, is more powerful than Yahweh, our God, then we're here forever. There's no hope. However, if we are here and all that we suffered is a terrible punishment from the Lord, our God, then there's hope, because we know He's merciful. If we get our act together, He'll take us back. His love is everlasting. So if you just read these fearful curses in isolation, you say, how awful. But if you were a slave in Babylon hearing them, you say, maybe God will take us back. Paradoxically, for the original readers, these awful curses were a source of hope. So that's what I'll say about the Pentateuch.